A serene autumn morning disrupted by a phone call that would change a family's life forever. David Anderson, a loving father, received news that his 73-year-old father had been asked to leave Pine Grove Nursing Home, a place he'd called home for the past 3 years. This wasn't just any ordinary eviction. The reason behind it would leave David questioning everything he thought he knew about elderly care in America. Harold Anderson was known throughout Pine Grove for his warm smile and gentle nature. Despite battling early-stage dementia, he spent his days sharing stories with other residents, helping the staff whenever he could, and bringing light to what could otherwise be lonely days at the facility. The staff often found him sharing his home-baked cookies, a recipe he somehow never forgot, with fellow residents, or teaching them how to play chess, a game he'd mastered over decades. But beneath the surface of this peaceful retirement community, something unsettling was brewing. The administration's sudden decision to remove Harold came without warning, leaving his son David scrambling for answers. What could a kind-hearted elderly man, who never caused trouble, have possibly done to deserve such treatment? As David drove to the nursing home that crisp morning, his mind raced with possibilities. His father's medical bills were paid on time, he was well behaved, and the staff had always praised Harold's presence. Something wasn't adding up. The familiar drive to Pine Grove felt different this time, each mile bringing him closer to a truth that would shake his faith in the system meant to protect our elderly. Walking through the nursing home's sliding doors, David noticed the unusual silence. The usual cheerful greetings from the staff were replaced with averted gazes and hushed whispers. Harold sat in the common area, confusion evident on his face, his few belongings packed in a worn suitcase beside him. But it wasn't the sight of his father's packed belongings that stopped David in his tracks, it was the piece of paper clutched in the administrator's hand. The reason for Harold's eviction would expose a deeply troubling practice that had been hidden behind Pine Grove's pristine walls. What David discovered that day would not only change his family's life but would spark a conversation about elderly care that would resonate with thousands of families across the country. As David reached for that fateful document, he couldn't have known that his father's story would become a symbol of resilience, justice, and the fight for dignity in our twilight years. The truth behind Harold's eviction was about to come to light, and nothing could prepare them for what was written on that paper. With trembling hands, David unfolded the document. The administrator, Mrs. Thompson, stood nearby, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible discomfort. The paper revealed a series of incidents that seemed completely out of character for Harold. According to the report, his father had been organizing weekly gatherings in the community room, innocent enough at first glance, but these meetings had caught the attention of management for an unexpected reason. Harold, it seemed, had been teaching other residents about their rights within the nursing home system. He'd been sharing information about patient advocacy, explaining healthcare policies in simple terms, and encouraging others to speak up about their concerns. The meetings had started small, just a few residents sharing stories over cookies and chess games, but they had grown into something more significant. The report listed dates and times when Harold had disrupted facility operations by helping fellow residents draft letters to management about various issues from meal quality to visiting hours. But what struck David most was the final paragraph, which detailed how his father had helped another resident's family identify and report billing discrepancies that had gone unnoticed for months. David's mind flashed back to conversations with his father over the past year. Harold had mentioned feeling troubled by the stories he'd heard from other residents, tales of loneliness, of feeling voiceless, of family members struggling with unexpected charges. But Harold, with his background as a retired high school teacher, had done what came naturally to him. He began educating and empowering others. As David read further, his initial shock turned to a mix of pride and concern. The document painted his father's actions as disruptive to facility harmony and potentially damaging to the institution's reputation. But between the lines, David could read something else: fear. Fear of residents becoming too aware, too organized, too willing to question the status quo. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat, pulling David back to the present moment. "Your father is well liked," she began cautiously, but we have protocols and procedures that need to be followed. These gatherings have become problematic." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We believe it would be best for everyone if Mr. Anderson found alternative accommodation." Meanwhile, Harold sat quietly, watching a group of residents who had gathered at a distance, their faces showing concern and sadness. One elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes, while others whispered among themselves. These were the people Harold had befriended, taught, and stood up for. The sight made David's heart ache. Looking closer at the document, David noticed something else: dates, times, and details that didn't quite align with his father's regular schedule. Some of these incidents were recorded during times when Harold had been out for medical appointments or family visits. Something wasn't right, and the more David read, the more questions emerged. A young nurse passed by, slipping David a folded note while pretending to adjust Harold's wheelchair. Her actions were quick, almost invisible, but the weight of that small paper in David's pocket felt significant. What information could she be risking her job to share? The answer to that question would have to wait, as Mrs. Thompson was now presenting discharge papers for signature. As David stood there, torn between immediate compliance and challenging the decision, he noticed his father's chess set still laid out on a nearby table. The pieces were positioned mid-game, a battle of wits left unfinished. It seemed symbolic, somehow a representation of the larger game being played, one where the rules weren't quite what they seemed, and the stakes were higher than anyone had realized. Once safely in the privacy of his car, with Harold resting in the passenger seat, David finally pulled out the folded note from his pocket. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, revealing hurried handwriting that simply read, "Check the maintenance closet on the 3rd floor. There's a blue binder behind the cleaning supplies. You need to see it before you leave." The nurse had included her phone number, signed only as a concerned employee. David glanced at his father, who had dozed off, peaceful despite the turmoil surrounding him. Making a quick decision, he gently woke Harold. "Dad, I need to get something from inside. Will you be okay here for a few minutes?" Harold nodded, reaching for his crossword puzzle book, one constant in his ever-changing world. Returning to the building, David took the stairs to avoid attention, his heart pounding with each step. The 3rd floor was quieter than the others, with most residents gathered downstairs for afternoon activities. The maintenance closet was tucked away in a corner, surprisingly unlocked. Inside, behind bottles of cleaning solution and stacks of paper towels, he found the blue binder. What he discovered inside made his blood run cold. Page after page of altered records, not just for his father, but for dozens of residents. Billing discrepancies, medication logs with suspicious corrections, and most disturbing of all, a list of problematic residents who had raised concerns about care quality. Harold's name was circled in red, along with 5 others who had all been discharged under questionable circumstances over the past year. As David photographed the pages with trembling hands, he heard footsteps approaching. Quickly returning the binder to its hiding place, he grabbed a paper towel roll as cover and stepped out, nearly colliding with Mrs. Thompson herself. Their eyes met, and in that moment, David saw something shift in her expression. She knew. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice artificially pleasant, "I thought you'd left already." Before David could respond, his phone buzzed a text from the nurse. "Did you find it? There's more. Meeting at Carter's Diner in 20 minutes. Bring your father's records." The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. David's mind raced with questions. How deep did this go? How many families had been affected? And most importantly, what happened to the other residents who had been forced out? But those questions were interrupted by commotion in the lobby. Harold was there, surrounded by residents and their families, all speaking at once. What David saw when he reached the lobby stopped him in his tracks. His father, fully awake now, stood tall despite his age, addressing the gathered crowd. The scene before him wasn't just a group of concerned residents, it was the very community Harold had built, standing together in solidarity. But it was what Harold held in his hands that made David's breath catch, a stack of papers that looked eerily similar to the documents in the blue binder upstairs. Mrs. Thompson rushed past David, phone in hand, urgently whispering to someone. Security guards appeared at the entrance, and the atmosphere grew tense. In that moment, David realized they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than just his father's eviction. The truth was about to break wide open, but with it came risks they hadn't anticipated. As Harold's voice carried across the lobby, sharing his own story, other residents began to speak up, one by one. Each story shared revealed another piece of a complex puzzle, building toward a revelation that would shake the very foundation of Pine Grove. But with Mrs. Thompson's urgent phone calls and the growing security presence, David knew they were racing against time. The next few minutes would determine not just Harold's future, but the fate of everyone involved in exposing the truth. Suddenly, the main doors swung open, and a distinguished-looking woman in a business suit strode in, flanked by two men carrying briefcases. The lobby fell silent as she surveyed the scene. David recognized her immediately from the local news. Sarah Mitchell, the state's deputy director of elder care services. Her unexpected presence sent whispers rippling through the crowd. But it was Harold's reaction that caught everyone off guard. Instead of showing concern, a slight smile crossed his face as he nodded in her direction. That's when David remembered before his retirement, Harold hadn't just been a teacher, he'd served on the state's Elder Rights Commission. The very commission that had established many of the guidelines Pine Grove was now allegedly violating. Mrs. Thompson rushed forward to greet Ms. Mitchell, her practiced smile barely masking her panic. "We weren't expecting you until next week's scheduled inspection," she stammered. The deputy director's response was cold and clear. Funny how anonymous tips can change schedules. She held up her phone, displaying an email with attached photos, the very same documents David had photographed minutes earlier. As if on cue, more cars pulled into the parking lot. Local news vans, marked with familiar logos, began setting up their equipment outside. David's phone buzzed again, another text from the nurse: "Don't let them destroy the evidence. Check the basement archives. Room B15. Code 4228. Hurry." Harold, showing a clarity that defied his usual dementia-clouded state, began addressing Ms. Mitchell directly. "Sarah, do you remember that conversation we had 15 years ago? About the importance of financial transparency in care facilities?" The deputy director's eyes widened with recognition, and David watched as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. But before Harold could continue, the power in the building suddenly cut out. Emergency lights cast an eerie glow across concerned faces. Through the confusion, David spotted Mrs. Thompson's assistant hurrying toward the basement stairs, clutching a laptop and several files. The sight sent a chill down his spine. They were trying to destroy the evidence. In the dim light, David noticed something else. Several residents had pulled out their phones, recording everything. One of them, a former court stenographer, had been documenting every word spoken since Harold began his address. The truth wasn't just in the files anymore, it was being broadcast live through dozens of devices. The nurse who had helped David appeared at his side, speaking in urgent whispers. "There's more than just billing fraud," she said, her voice trembling. "Some residents who were discharged never made it to their new facilities. They simply disappeared from the system." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. As security guards moved to block the basement access, Ms. Mitchell stepped forward, her authority clear in every movement. "Lock down this facility," she commanded. "No one leaves, and nothing gets deleted." But her order came seconds too late. The distinct sound of a shredder hummed from somewhere below, and the acrid smell of burning paper began seeping through the ventilation system. Harold's voice cut through the chaos, stronger than David had heard in years. "It's not just Pine Grove," he announced, pulling a worn notebook from his jacket pocket. "This is happening across the state. And we have proof." The notebook, filled with Harold's neat teacher's handwriting, contained names, dates, and connections that spanned multiple facilities and years of systematic abuse. David watched as his father, the man he'd worried couldn't take care of himself, stood at the center of what was quickly becoming the biggest elderly care scandal in the state's history. But even as pride swelled in his chest, fear gripped his heart. Because through the crowd, he spotted Mrs. Thompson making a phone call, her words barely audible but chilling, "Initiate Protocol Zero." Now, no one in the lobby knew what Protocol Zero meant, but the look of horror on the nurse's face suggested they were about to find out. The words Protocol Zero triggered an immediate chain reaction. Automatic locks engaged on all exterior doors, and metal shutters began descending over the windows. The nurse grabbed David's arm, her face pale. "They're trying to contain the story," she whispered. "This protocol was designed for disease outbreaks, but they're using it to trap us all inside." But Mrs. Thompson hadn't counted on one crucial detail. Harold Anderson hadn't spent 3 years at Pine Grove just playing chess and baking cookies. He'd been mapping out every inch of the building, including its emergency systems. As the shutters descended, Harold calmly walked to the facility's maintenance panel, hidden behind a decorative painting. With steady hands, he entered a code, and suddenly the shutters froze halfway. "You learn a lot when people think you're just a confused old man," Harold said, his voice carrying across the now silent lobby. "Like how the night janitor keeps complaining about having to reset this system every month." The gathered crowd burst into applause, but their celebration was premature. Mrs. Thompson's phone call had reached beyond just the facility's security system. Police sirens wailed in the distance, approaching quickly. But as they arrived, they were met by state investigators who had been quietly surrounding the building since Ms. Mitchell's arrival. The deputy director's preparation had anticipated every move. In the basement, the sound of shredding stopped abruptly, replaced by the firm voices of state officials who had accessed the lower level through an emergency exit. The assistant who had rushed down earlier was escorted back upstairs, the laptop and files now in official custody. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the residents, a quiet woman who had rarely spoken during her 2 years at Pine Grove, stepped forward. "I was their bookkeeper," she announced, her voice shaking but determined. "Before they moved me here, I worked for their parent company. I've been keeping records of everything." From her wheelchair, she pulled out a USB drive that had been carefully sewn into her sweater's hem. As state officials began reviewing the files, the true scope of the scandal emerged. Pine Grove was just one facility in a vast network of nursing homes systematically exploiting elderly residents. The problematic residents who had disappeared hadn't just been transferred, they had been strategically scattered across different facilities to prevent them from sharing their stories. Mrs. Thompson tried to make a break for a side door, only to find herself face to face with Harold's chess partner, a former police detective who had been documenting suspicious activities for months. "Checkmate," he said quietly, blocking her exit until authorities could reach her. The news crews outside were capturing everything through the half-lowered shutters, broadcasting live as decades of corruption unraveled. But the biggest revelation came from Harold himself. Reaching into his chest box, he removed a false bottom, revealing hundreds of letters from families across the state, each documenting similar experiences at different facilities. He had been building this case long before his own dementia diagnosis, knowing that someday he might not remember the details himself. As state officials led Mrs. Thompson and several administrators away in handcuffs, David turned to his father in amazement. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Harold's eyes twinkled with their old sharpness as he responded, "Sometimes, son, the best way to protect your family is to let them think you need protection." But even as the immediate crisis resolved, Harold's expression turned serious. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling out one final document from his chest box. "Something about the company's expansion plans. They're not just targeting the elderly." He handed the paper to Ms. Mitchell, whose face darkened as she read it. The battle they just won, it seemed, was only the beginning of a much larger war. In the days that followed, Pine Grove underwent a complete transformation. The state appointed a new administration team, led by professionals with proven track records in ethical elderly care. The facility's residents, no longer afraid to speak up, formed an official resident council, with Harold serving as their first elected representative despite his initial protests that his chess games kept him too busy. The story made national headlines, sparking investigations into elderly care facilities across the country. Harold's meticulously collected evidence exposed a network of corruption that had exploited vulnerable seniors for years. But more importantly, it started a crucial conversation about how society treats its elderly members. David watched with pride as his father testified before the state legislature, his voice strong and clear as he advocated for stricter oversight and better protection for nursing home residents. The former high school teacher had become an unexpected champion for elderly rights, proving that age and health challenges couldn't diminish a person's ability to fight for what's right. The nurse who had helped expose the truth, Jennifer Parker, was promoted to Director of Patient Care under the new administration. Her first action was to establish a transparent communication system between residents, their families, and staff. The mysterious disappearances of problematic residents were thoroughly investigated, leading to reunions of families who had lost track of their loved ones in the corrupt system. Harold's chess partner, the former detective, started a volunteer program where retired law enforcement officers would regularly visit nursing homes, providing an extra layer of oversight and security. The program quickly spread to other facilities, creating a network of watchful eyes protecting elderly residents. As for Mrs. Thompson and her conspirators, they faced criminal charges that would ensure they could never work in healthcare again. The company's expansion plans, which Harold had uncovered, revealed their intentions to extend their exploitative practices into children's care facilities, a scheme that was stopped before it could begin. 6 months later, David sat in Pine Grove's community room, watching his father teach chess to a group of new residents. The facility had become a model for ethical elderly care, with other nursing homes sending their staff there for training. Harold's cookies were still a daily tradition, but now they were served during resident council meetings where seniors actively participated in decisions affecting their care. "You know," Harold said that evening, as he and David shared their usual cup of tea, "I never planned to be an activist at 73. I just couldn't bear watching people lose their dignity because someone saw them as profitable rather than human." He moved his bishop across the chessboard, a familiar twinkle in his eye. Sometimes the best moves in life, like in chess, are the ones nobody sees coming. The blue binder that had helped expose the truth now sat in a display case in Pine Grove's lobby, alongside photos documenting the facility's transformation. But more meaningful were the smiles on residents' faces and the steady stream of families visiting their loved ones, no longer worried about the quality of care their relatives received. As David prepared to leave that evening, he noticed a group of residents gathered around Harold, listening intently as he shared stories from his teaching days. His father's dementia still caused difficult moments, but here, surrounded by people who respected and valued him, Harold was thriving. The man who had been labeled as problematic had become a living reminder that age doesn't determine a person's worth or their ability to change the world. Walking to his car, David passed the facility's new mission statement, prominently displayed at the entrance: dignity, respect, and community. Every life matters at every age. Below it, someone had added a handwritten note: "And don't forget the cookies." David smiled, knowing that in his own unique way, Harold had not just saved himself, he had helped create a legacy that would protect generations to come.